Hello there. Tonight we are going to wander slowly through marble corridors, drift past cracked columns and eavesdrop on senators who once believed their power was eternal. The smell of olive oil, the distant clang of sandals on stone, and the murmur of Latin phrases fill the air. Rome is still glorious for now. You're arriving at the height of an empire that stretches across 3 continents, commands legions beyond counting, and believes it will never fall. But beneath that gleaming facade, the cracks are already spreading. You probably won't survive. Not if you're poor, not if you're a soldier, not if you speak the wrong language in the wrong alleyway, and certainly not if you find yourself on the wrong end of a Praetorian's spear or the economy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is over there. Drop your location and local hour in the comments, especially if you're listening from somewhere ancient like London or Ohio. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. The thing is, Rome didn't collapse in a day or even a century. It just frayed. Picture a robe of imperial purple unraveling one loose thread at a time while everyone pretended nothing was wrong. In the 2nd century, Rome was enjoying the golden afterglow of emperors like Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius. The roads were straight, the baths were hot, and grain ships still sailed safely into Ostia. If you asked anyone, senator, slave, soldier, they'd probably say, "We're doing fine." But let's hover a little closer. That senator's estates, overworked by tenant farmers drowning in taxes. That soldier paid an increasingly worthless coin, spending more time pacifying internal revolts than fighting foreign enemies. That slave, praying their master doesn't get bored and decide to test a new punishment philosophy today. Here's the uncomfortable truth: Rome looks stable because it was massive, but size only buys you the illusion of stability. Underneath it all was an empire stretched like dough, too thin across a baking sheet. One small tear, and the whole thing sags. And those tears were coming slowly then suddenly. One of them, overconfidence. The belief that Roman systems, legal, political, military, were eternal. But eternal turns out to be a PR term, not a reality. Another was complacency. Rome began to believe its own myth that its borders were unbreakable, its culture superior, its enemies disorganized. And when you believe you're invincible, you start acting very stupid. Meanwhile, rural areas were already hollowing out. The population tilted toward the cities drawn in by games and grain handouts, leaving the countryside underproduced and underdefended. Think of it like everyone deciding to move to one apartment building while the rest of the country goes to weeds. Historians still debate whether this demographic shift was inevitable or driven by failed policy. Either way it happened, the empire's balance shifted and then tilted. But what about the emperors? Surely someone up top noticed. Well, some did. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, saw the signs. He tried to rule with wisdom, discipline, and duty. Then he died and passed the throne to his son, a gladiator fanboy named Commodus. You'll meet him soon. Spoiler alert, he's not a spreadsheet guy. Rome's strength wasn't just in its armies or its aqueducts, it was in the sense that it worked. The idea that it was worth defending. But what happens when that faith starts to flicker? Here's a hint. Soldiers start selling the throne to the highest bidder. Governors start declaring themselves emperors. And farmers stop farming not because they're lazy, but because there's no point. And still the Senate debated. Still the temples echoed with prayers. Still the circuses ran and the bathhouses steamed. But the glory it had already started to whisper away. Tonight you'll walk the long twilight path with Rome. You'll pass triumphal arches and ash-filled ruins. You'll meet generals, usurpers, martyrs, and emperors who ruled for weeks before being stabbed in a hallway by someone they just promoted. And as you drift further into sleep, know this. We're not just telling Rome's story, we're telling ours. Because every civilization thinks it's eternal. Until it isn't. Let's keep going. Commodus wasn't the first bad emperor Rome had. But he was one of the most theatrical, and that's saying something. His reign didn't just represent decline. It practically staged a full-on production of it, complete with costumes, catchphrases, and an emperor who thought he was Hercules reincarnated. Yes, really. The son of Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher king Commodus, flipped his inheritance upside down like a coin in the arena. He didn't want to be a philosopher. He wanted to be a gladiator. Not figuratively, not as a hobby. He literally dressed up in lion skins, carried a club, and entered the Colosseum to fight wild animals, except the animals had been drugged or chained up ahead of time because gods forbid the emperor actually break a sweat. He charged the Roman treasury a small fortune for each performance, claiming a victory fee after every stage match. This was the guy steering the world's most powerful empire, and he preferred the adoration of bloodthirsty crowds to the mind-numbing work of running a civilization. If you're thinking surely someone stopped him, you'd be right eventually. But not before Rome got a clear message. The imperial throne was no longer sacred. It could be clowned on, played with, and paraded like a circus act. The damage wasn't just reputational. Commodus's reign began the steady erosion of institutional credibility. He neglected the Senate marginalized traditional aristocrats and surrounded himself with flatterers' favorites and increasingly sketchy advisors. One of them, a freedman named Cleander, actually sold government offices to the highest bidder. Want to be governor? Just outbid the other guy. Historians still debate whether Commodus was simply mad, manipulated, or malevolent. But what's undeniable is that he transformed the role of emperor from guardian of Rome to celebrity mascot, and the institutions around him followed suit, decaying quietly while everyone cheered his latest stunt in the arena. Eventually, a conspiracy formed. In 192 CE, after nearly 13 years of misrule, Commodus was strangled in his bath by a wrestler hired by his inner circle. This wasn't an act of justice, it was damage control. Rome couldn't survive much more of him. But here's the kicker. His death didn't stabilize the empire, it made everything worse. With Commodus gone and no clear successor, the imperial seat became a free-for-all. A year that began with a murder ended in an auction. Yes, an actual auction. After a short-lived emperor named Pertinax tried to restore order and got killed by his own bodyguards. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers meant to protect the emperor, decided to auction off the throne to the highest bidder. Enter Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator who won the crown by offering each guard 25,000 sesterces. That's several years' wages for one soldier. He ruled for all of 9 weeks. When word of the imperial sale reached the provinces, legions elsewhere were horrified. Generals in Gaul, Syria, and along the Danube all declared their own emperors. Within months, the empire had 3 men claiming to rule it, and none of them were named Julianus. Civil war erupted. Rome's center was no longer secure. The provinces had learned they could ignore whoever wore the purple robe and just back their own man instead. The dominoes were starting to fall. Meanwhile, the economy was unraveling. The lavish spending of Commodus combined with a bloated imperial court and rampant corruption meant the treasury was empty. To raise funds, the government began debasing the currency, cutting the silver content of coins until they were mostly bronze with a sad silver coating. People noticed. Confidence in Roman money plummeted and prices soared. What used to cost 7 denarii now cost 70, then 700. Worse yet, people started refusing coin altogether. They'd rather be paid in goods or in grain or not at all. This wasn't just an economic problem, it was a spiritual one. Money only works if people believe in it. Rome had believed, but that belief was fading. Back in the capital, emperors came and went like fashion trends. Between 235 and 284 CE, the empire saw over 20 emperors, most of them military men declared by their troops and usually murdered by those same troops before they had time to decorate the palace. Some reigned for months, a few just weeks. It became a pattern: assassinate the emperor, declare your general the new one, march on Rome, bribe the Senate, and then wait for someone else to stab you in the back. The throne wasn't just unstable, it was radioactive. And while the power struggles festered, the frontier strained. Germanic tribes pushed against the Rhine. The Sassanid Empire raided from the east. Pirates disrupted trade. Every year brought new threats and fewer legions to respond. The real tragedy Many Romans didn't even notice. Life in the cities, especially Rome, still offered bread and games. The baths still steamed, the temples still echoed with prayers. Most people assumed the empire would last forever because it always had. That's the curse of greatness. It feels permanent until the very moment it isn't. Take a moment to picture it, a senatorial banquet with glistening olives and reclining elites sipping watered wine while debating Virgil. Just a few miles from a garrison mutiny, or a grain ship arriving in Ostia as Germanic raiders torch a town in Gaul. Rome's reality had split into layers, one of decadence, one of chaos. Odd fact, Emperor Elagabalus, who ruled in the midst of this instability, once threw a banquet where he served peas laced with gold dust and reportedly smothered dinner guests with flower petals that fell from the ceiling. He was eventually murdered by his own guards. He was 18. The empire was still putting on a good show, but the cracks were now canyons. By the end of the 3rd century, Rome was a shimmering illusion, huge, yes, but hollowed. The Senate was ceremonial. The praetorians were mercenary, and the emperors disposable. But there were still a few who tried to fix it. One of them would come next, an emperor with big plans, harsh taxes, and a retirement hobby of cabbage gardening. You'll meet him soon. Enter Diocletian, a man who came from nothing and decided to run everything. When he took power in 284 CE, the Roman Empire was practically on fire. Armies were rebelling. Emperors were dropping like flies. The economy was in freefall, and the borders were so porous you could walk from Germania to Gaul without bumping into a single Roman soldier or tax collector or functioning government. So Diocletian looked at this mess and said, I need a plan. And also 3 co-workers. He didn't just want to rule Rome, he wanted to rebuild it from the ground up. His solution was ambitious, bureaucratic, and incredibly stressful. To pronounce before coffee, the Tetrarchy. The idea was simple in theory. No one man could govern the entire empire anymore. So Diocletian split it into east and west, each half ruled by an Augustus, with a junior emperor or Caesar beneath him to handle overflow and eventually take over. In other words, a Roman buddy system. Diocletian ruled the east. His buddy Maximian got the west. Their Caesars Galerius and Constantius handled border defense and awkward palace parties. The whole setup was supposed to bring stability, smooth succession, and reduce the chances of a general waking up one morning and deciding, you know what, I should be emperor today. Ooh. Historians still debate whether the Tetrarchy worked as intended or just delayed the inevitable. But it did buy the empire a few decades of breathing room. That's not nothing. Diocletian didn't stop with power sharing. He restructured the provinces, dividing them into smaller units so no single governor got too powerful. He beefed up tax collection, increased military recruitment, and basically wrapped the entire empire in a giant spiderweb of paperwork. There were now more officials, more clerks, more middlemen, and of course more taxes. The people weren't exactly thrilled, but hey, the borders were holding again. For a little while. To fight inflation, Diocletian issued one of the most infamous pieces of economic micromanagement in ancient history, the Edict on Maximum Prices. Picture this, a list of over 1,000 goods and services, everything from a sack of grain to a barber's haircut to a lion for the amphitheater with fixed prices you were legally forbidden to exceed. If you sold above the limit, death. If you hoarded goods, death. If you tried to reason with the tax assessor, death, probably. It was a bold idea. It also completely failed. Merchants ignored it. Black markets exploded. Trade shriveled. And somewhere probably in the corner of a crowded marketplace, a man was quietly bartering 3 goats and a spoon for a loaf of price-controlled bread. The intention was noble stop, runaway inflation, protect the poor, restore confidence. But the empire's real economic problem wasn't prices, it was scarcity. You can't legislate value into existence, especially when your silver coins contain more tin than your cutlery. And then there was the religious elephant in the forum, Christianity. By Diocletian's time, Christians were no longer an obscure cult hiding in basements. They were teachers, merchants, even soldiers. Their refusal to participate in state rituals, especially emperor worship, was seen as dangerous, disloyal, un-Roman. So Diocletian, who genuinely believed in the old gods, decided to fix this problem. In 303 CE, he launched the Great Persecution, the last and most brutal attempt to wipe out Christianity in the Roman Empire. Churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, clergy arrested, citizens were ordered to sacrifice to the gods or face prison torture or worse. Some complied, many didn't. The persecution backfired. Rather than stamp out Christianity, it created martyrs, men and women whose calm acceptance of death became a powerful example of faith. The underground church only grew stronger. And the empire, it started to look increasingly cruel, outdated and insecure. Odd fact, Diocletian's palace, built for his retirement in what is now Croatia, still stands and forms the heart of the modern city of Split. You can walk its hallways today. There's a pizza place inside it. After 2 decades of tireless reform and iron-fisted rule, Diocletian did something almost no one expected. He retired. In 305 CE, he stepped down, voluntarily, said goodbye to the purple robes, left the palace, and went home to grow cabbages. He even turned down requests to return during later crises, allegedly replying, "If you could see the cabbages I grow, you wouldn't ask me to rule again." And just like that, the man who had saved the empire from collapse disappeared into his garden. Without his firm hand, though, the tetrarchy unraveled in record time. Maximian, his Western co-emperor, unretired almost immediately. The Caesars Galerius and Constantius jockeyed for position. New generals saw opportunity. Alliances shifted, betrayals multiplied, and the empire plunged right back into civil war, this time with more emperors than ever. At one point, there were 6 men claiming the imperial title simultaneously, and while this imperial soap opera played out Diocletian's system collapsed into factionalism. The bureaucracy he built remained, but without unity. At the top, the system jammed. It's like building the world's most elaborate coffee machine, then throwing 6 toddlers into the control room. Out of that chaos would rise someone extraordinary, a man who saw a vision in the sky, painted a symbol on his soldier shields, and led the empire toward a future no one could have predicted. But we'll get to him soon. Back in the day-to-day, Rome's problems hadn't gone anywhere. Inflation still lingered, the countryside still emptied, the borders still trembled, and the people. They got used to change. One emperor, then another, a tax reform, then another, gods worshipped one year, outlawed the next. What didn't change was the slow creeping feeling that Rome, while still vast, still wealthy, still full of pomp, wasn't really working anymore. Yes, the aqueducts still ran, yes, the forums still buzzed, yes, the soldiers still marched, but it was all brittle, like a statue of marble with cracks just beneath the surface. And sometimes when the wind was right, you could hear it groan. You remember that guy we teased at the end of the last part, the one with the vision in the sky? His name was Constantine. And depending on who you ask, he either saved the Roman Empire or accidentally rewired it forever. Maybe both. Born around 272 CE in what is now Serbia, Constantine was the son of a Roman officer, Constantius Chlorus, who later became one of the tetrarchs under Diocletian's elaborate power-sharing system. Constantine grew up in the orbit of emperors, spending his youth at court, watching the kind of people who made assassination look like a team sport. By the time his father died in 306 CE, Constantine was already being eyed as a potential heir. But this being Rome, things weren't so simple. Instead of a smooth transition, there was a power struggle involving 6 emperors, 3 rival factions, and enough family drama to make Thanksgiving dinner in a soap opera seem tame. In the midst of this mess, Constantine made his move. He marched on Rome to confront one of his most dangerous rivals, Maxentius, who had taken control of the city. Their armies met at the Milvian Bridge, just outside the capital. And here's where things get mystical. According to the ancient biographer Eusebius, on the eve of battle, Constantine saw a vision, a glowing cross in the sky, accompanied by the words, "In hoc signo vinces." In this sign you will conquer. That night, Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint a Christian symbol, the Chi-Rho, on their shields. The next day, his army routed Maxentius, whose forces were swept into the Tiber River along with the emperor himself. Historians still debate whether this vision actually happened, or whether it was a clever bit of divine branding added after the fact. Either way, Constantine believed or wanted people to believe that Christianity had delivered him victory, and he never forgot it. Within a year, Constantine issued the Aegifi, Edict of Milaneri Perci, 313 CE, which granted religious tolerance throughout the empire and effectively legalized Christianity. This was not just some side note in history, it was a tectonic shift in the spiritual architecture of Rome. A persecuted fringe sect had gone mainstream practically overnight. Of course, Constantine didn't outlaw the old gods. He still used pagan titles like Pontifex Maximus and allowed traditional worship to continue. But he poured money and support into the Christian church, commissioning basilicas, donating imperial land, and granting privileges to Christian clergy. He even called a council yes, a corporate-style convention of bishops in the city of Nicaea, to settle disputes about Jesus' nature. You know you've reached a new era when an emperor steps in to mediate a theological food fight. But Constantine's most visible legacy wasn't a vision or a council, it was a city. In 330 CE, he inaugurated Constantinople, the new Rome, built on the site of the old Greek town of Byzantium. Strategically located between Europe and Asia, it had a natural harbor defensible terrain and excellent real estate potential. The city quickly became a bustling imperial capital full of palaces, churches, and a massive hippodrome where chariot races would one day cause actual riots. Constantine had shifted the empire's center of gravity eastward, probably forever. Rome, the eternal city, was still symbolically important, but its political relevance was now fading. The West was fragmenting, while the East was consolidating under Greek influence and imperial control. Odd fact. Constantine waited until his deathbed to be baptized. Maybe he was hedging his bets. Maybe he just wanted to sin freely and then hit the divine reset button at the very end. Either way, he died in 337 CE, having reshaped the empire in ways no one could have imagined when he first marched under that strange symbol in the sky. But legacy is a funny thing. Constantine left the empire to his sons. 3 of them. And surprise, they didn't get along. Civil wars broke out again, the realm split and resplit. By the end of the 4th century, the idea of a united empire was more nostalgic than real. Meanwhile, the Christian church he had nurtured was growing in power and disagreement. Some bishops pushed for a peaceful spiritual kingdom. Others cozied up to emperors and argued over doctrine with the ferocity of gladiators. In one generation, Christians had gone from underground to upper class. It was, frankly, disorienting. Temples to Jupiter were being shut down, statues defaced, festivals banned. Pagan priests found themselves out of work, their traditions labeled superstitious or demonic. In 380 CE, Christianity was declared the official religion of the empire under Theodosius the Great, and the old gods were officially evicted. This wasn't just a religious shift, it was a cultural rebranding. Rome had always prided itself on its traditions, its rituals, its ancient customs passed down through generations. But now, much of that was being swept away, replaced by a new moral universe, one with different holidays, different heroes, and a different idea of what it meant to be Roman. Historians still debate whether Christianity hastened the empire's decline or helped extend its life by offering new cohesion. What's clear is that it changed the game, deeply, irrevocably. And just as the internal foundations were shifting, the frontiers began to creak again. Rome's relationship with the so-called barbarians had always been complicated. Some were enemies, some were allies, some were both on alternate Tuesdays. Many Germanic tribes, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, had fought alongside Roman legions for years as mercenaries or federates, allied tribal groups granted land in exchange for military service. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but as Rome's own population dwindled and tax revenues shrank, these tribal allies became less cooperative and more assertive. In 376 CE, a tribe called the Visigoths asked the Eastern Roman authorities for asylum, hoping to escape an even worse threat coming from the steppes, the Huns. The Romans let them in, but treated them terribly. Starved, abused, and exploited, the Visigoths revolted. 2 years later, they annihilated a Roman army at the Battle of Adrianople. The Eastern Emperor Valens was killed along with 2/3 of his troops. The spell was broken, Rome's military invincibility gone. Even worse, the Visigoths didn't go home, they stayed, they negotiated, they marched deeper into imperial territory. Their leader, Alaric Gavurturst, would eventually become the man who did the unthinkable. He sacked Rome, but let's not rush. At this point in our story, the Roman Empire is still breathing, still shiny on the outside, still calling itself eternal, but the bones are getting brittle. The emperors now spend more time reacting than ruling. The economy wobbles between inflation and collapse, and a generation of young men is growing up Roman in name only, trained by tribal warlords loyal to gold, skeptical of glory. The sun still rises over Constantinople, senators still meet in Rome, bishops still argue in Nicaea. But in the forests beyond the Danube, something is stirring, something hungry. The snow had come early that year. It blanketed the trees near the Rhine frontier in brittle silence, and beneath that icy crust the ground shook. Not from an earthquake, from boots. Tens of thousands of them, Germanic tribes on the move, dragging their carts, families, cattle, and weapons across a frozen river that had once formed the boundary between civilization and everything Rome preferred not to think about. It was December 406 CE, and the Urhine River froze solid. But listen, nature opened the door. The barbarians walked in. They came in waves. Vandals. Alans. Suebi. Tribes with old grudges and new hunger. What began as a trickle became a flood. They poured into Roman Gaul, overwhelming what few defenses were still standing. And if you're wondering why the legions didn't show up to stop them, well, most of them weren't there anymore. Rome had already pulled its troops back toward Italy. Gaul, once the proud heartland of Roman strength and wine exports, was now mostly left to fend for itself. The local Roman authorities panicked. They negotiated, bribed, and begged for peace, but peace had left the empire along with the tax base. The barbarians didn't just pass through, they settled. They carved out territories, set up their own systems, and slowly the idea of Roman land started fading from maps and from minds. This was not a single cataclysmic invasion. It was more like watching a vase tip over in slow motion, knowing it's going to shatter, but being unable to catch it. And all of it, the frozen Rhine, the fleeing generals, the collapsing order, set the stage for something unthinkable. In 1210, Sifr, the Visigoths under Alaric, arrived at the gates of Rome. Let that sink in. For the first time in nearly 800 years, a foreign army stood before the walls of the Eternal City. This wasn't some provincial outpost. This was Rome. The heart, the symbol, the city that had once ruled the world. It had been centuries since the Romans even considered the idea of someone breaching its walls. That sort of thing just didn't happen. Rome didn't get sacked. But it did now. Alaric wasn't just any warlord. He had once served in the Roman army. He knew their tactics. He spoke Latin. He had even been promised land and titles by the imperial court. Promises which, like many others in this era, were broken. He was tired of being strung along, so he came to collect. Rome tried to negotiate. The Senate offered him gold, silver, silk, and pepper. Yes, pepper was a big deal, but Alaric laughed. The thicker the hay, he said, the easier it is mowed. And on August 24th, 410, someone likely disgruntled slaves inside the city opened the gates. The Visigoths poured in. They looted, they smashed, they burned, but they didn't stay. Alaric's men took what they could and moved on. This wasn't conquest. This was a statement. Rome is vulnerable. Historians still debate how destructive the sack actually was. Some sources claim restraint, others describe chaos. What's certain is the psychological impact. Rome had fallen, even if only for 3 days. And to the citizens of the empire, that fact shattered something far more delicate than marble, the illusion of invincibility. Saint Jerome, living in Bethlehem at the time, wrote with horror, "The bright light of all the world was put out." Let's pause here for an odd fact. During the sack, many Visigoth soldiers, being Christian like most Romans by then, refused to harm churches. Some even escorted terrified civilians into sanctuaries for protection. Welcome to the late Roman Empire, where your enemies pray in the same buildings you do. Rome recovered, sort of. The building still stood, the Senate still met, but something fundamental had changed. You could smell it in the air, fear. The empire had always imagined itself as eternal. Now that myth was broken and everyone's senators, bishops, bakers felt it. And then came the Wandelsburg. They'd originally crossed into Gaul back in 406, but by the 420s they had moved on into Hispania, then across the Strait of Gibraltar into North Africa. This was a bold move. North Africa wasn't just another province. It was the breadbasket of the Western Empire. The fields of Carthage and the surrounding countryside supplied grain to feed bully. Millions. Especially the increasingly hungry citizens of Rome. When the Vandals captured Carthage in 439 C, it wasn't just another sack, it was a stranglehold. Rome's grain supply dried up. The city's population, already declining, shrank further. Prices rose, bread lines grew, but the Vandals weren't done. In 455, Tiferu, their king, Genseric launched a naval expedition directly to Rome. This time, the city wasn't merely sacked. It was the Dimpi systematically stripped poor. Art, gold treasures, even the gilded bronze tiles from the old Temple of Jupiter. All of it was carted off to North Africa. This sack was so thorough, so coldly efficient that the term vandalism, arscorbas, comes from it. That's their legacy. An entire tribe immortalized in the English language as a synonym for senseless destruction. It wasn't senseless, though. It was strategic. Rome had nothing left to protect itself. Its military had become a patchwork of mercenaries, tribal federates, and local militias with shifting loyalties and empty pockets. Even the emperors were by this point more mascot than monarch. The Western court had already moved from Rome to War-Arburatur, Aporkukisur, or Ravenna, Wosuyabur Ukis. A marshy city, easier to defend and harder to starve. There, behind swampy barriers, child emperors came and went like decorative throw pillows. The last of them, Romulus Augustulus, a teenager installed by his father, a military officer named Orestes, in 476 CE. A Germanic warlord named Odoacer demanded land in Italy for his troops. Orestes said no. So Odoacer invaded Ravenna, killed Orestes, and forced the boy emperor to abdicate. Then he did something remarkable. He sent the imperial regalia, the crown, the robes, the scepter back to Constantinople, to the Eastern Roman emperor, and declared, "We don't need a Western emperor anymore. I'll just rule Italy as king." And just like that, the Western Roman Empire was done. Not with a final battle, not with a dramatic speech or volcanic eruption, but with a quiet transfer of robes. A teenage boy stepping down. A title returned in a diplomatic pouch. Odd fact, Odoacer didn't kill Romulus. He gave him a pension and sent him to live out his days in comfort on a country estate. Rome's last emperor lived. His empire did not. But what even was the Roman Empire at that point? No more provinces, no functioning army, no treasury, just a marble skeleton haunted by titles and rituals that no longer meant anything. And yet, people still called themselves Roman, because in some way Rome wasn't dead. Not yet. The torch had passed eastward to Constantinople, to the emperors who still ruled in Latin on paper and Greek in practice. But that's a story for another night. The strange thing about endings is that they often feel like transitions. One day you have an emperor in Rome. The next, he's in exile with a generous pension and a garden full of olive trees. But life keeps going. The sun still rises over crumbling basilicas. The aqueducts still trickle for now. And people still call themselves Roman even when the Rome they mean is 900 miles to the east. That's where we are now, the Eastern Roman Empire. A glittering Greek-speaking ghost of the old world that stubbornly refused to fall. While the Western Empire wheezed its last breath in the 5th century, the East was doing surprisingly okay. Headquartered in Constantinople. The city Constantine had built like a backup hard drive for the empire of the Eastern Romans, whom we now call the Byzantines. Though they never called themselves that, held on. For centuries. And not just held on, they thrived, at least at first. The city itself was a marvel. Its location was genius, perched on a peninsula between Europe and Asia, surrounded by water and walls. Constantinople could control trade routes and resist invasions. Its fortifications were legendary, layered stone ramparts that made barbarian hordes bounce off like bugs on a windshield. Even when the Goths were sacking Rome and the Vandals were looting her grain ships, Constantinople was commissioning mosaics, debating theology, and selling silk. The Eastern emperors kept up the Roman image eagles, Latin titles, even chariot races in the Hippodrome, but with a distinctly Greek twist. And of course they were Christians. Emphatically, dogmatically, sometimes violently so. The state and the church were now welded together. Emperors no longer just ruled people, they also ruled doctrine. If you thought Roman emperors were proud before, try giving them the power to declare what kind of bread Jesus would have eaten. Historians still debate whether this merging of church and state gave the Eastern Empire strength or sowed the seeds of future division. On the one hand, it gave society a unifying ideology. On the other, it turned spiritual disagreement into national crisis. Bishops weren't just theologians, they were political players. And when they disagreed, cities could riot, literally, over whether Jesus had one nature or two. But let's not get too far ahead. For now, what matters is that the Eastern Empire endured. It still had money. Trade flowed from the east, silk, spices, gold. The bureaucracy bloated, though it still functioned. Soldiers still drew pay. Generals still won battles. And yet it wasn't Rome, not in the old sense. The East had its own culture, its own saints, its own rivalries. Latin slowly faded. Greek became dominant. The Senate in Constantinople was more theatre than power. And the emperors, though still called Augustus and Caesar, now ruled like Byzantine monarchs, draped in robes, seated behind screens, touched only by eunuchs. You couldn't just walk into the imperial palace anymore. You had to navigate layers of ritual. Bow 3 times, prostrate yourself, wait to be acknowledged. It was a far cry from the days of Augustus, who styled himself as first among equals while casually sipping wine with senators. Odd fact. By the 10th century, the Byzantines had developed a mechanical throne that could rise and fall during audiences and golden lions that roared when visitors approached. It was politics by animatronic. The Byzantines were masters of presentation, diplomacy, and survival, but they weren't invincible. To the North Slavs and Bulgars pressed in. To the Geats, the revived Persian Empire specifically, the Sassanids continued the ancient rivalry with long grinding wars over Mesopotamia and Armenia. And then in the 7th century, came something new, something fast, something fiery. Islam. The Arab conquest exploded out of the Arabian Peninsula like a whirlwind. Within a few decades, they had taken Syria, Palestine, Egypt, all formerly Roman provinces. Alexandria fell, Antioch fell, Jerusalem. Fell. It was a shock. The Byzantine heartland shrank dramatically. Trade routes shifted. The empire's tax base collapsed. And for the first time, Constantinople itself came under siege, Arab fleets in the Bosphorus battering the city walls, while Greek fire rained down from Byzantine ships like a dragon's breath. But the city held. That was the pattern for centuries. The Byzantines would lose, regroup, reform, and survive. They had bureaucrats who could squeeze gold from a stone, generals who turned retreat into ambush, emperors who could out-scheme a serpent in a cassock. Still, the losses added up. By the 9th century, the empire was a fraction of its former size. The West had moved on. Charlemagne crowned himself Holy Roman Emperor. In 800, despite the glaring issue that the actual Roman Empire was still very much a thing just in the East. This made for some awkward diplomatic letters. But the Byzantines persisted. They codified Roman law into the Corpus Juris Civilis Iud Cronder of Justinian, which would influence European legal systems for 1,000 years. They preserved classical learning copying manuscripts while the West fumbled through post-collapse chaos. They gave us domes, icons, and orthodox theology. They held the line until they didn't. Sukkot 24. During the Fourth Crusade, a military expedition that was supposed to liberate Jerusalem, Western Crusaders instead sacked Constantinople. Not Muslims, not Persians, not Huns, Christians, Western Europeans. The Latin sack of Constantinople was brutal, chaotic, and unforgivable. The city was looted, its churches desecrated, its people massacred. Priceless relics were carted off to Venice and Paris. The empire was shattered, reduced to a rump state, struggling to reassemble itself. The Byzantines did retake the city in 1261, but they never fully recovered. Constantinople, once a beacon, became a shadow. The empire was surrounded by rising Turkish powers, especially the Ottomans, who methodically gobbled up territory like a chess player trapping a king. And then came the end, on December 29th, 1453. After a 53-day siege, the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, breached the walls of Constantinople. The last emperor, Constantine IV, reputedly threw off his imperial regalia and charged into the fighting. His body was never found. The Roman Empire, founded in 27 BCE, divided in 285. CE collapsed in the West in 476 and carried on in the East for nearly another 1,000 years. Was no more. Or was it? Because even as the walls crumbled, the Dias of Rome lived on. In Russia, the Tsars styled themselves as heirs to Byzantium III Rome. In Italy, Renaissance thinkers rediscovered Latin texts preserved in Byzantine monasteries. In Jerusalem, Britain and America, political philosophers built republics using Roman blueprints, Senate's courts checks and balances. And in our own minds, Rome remains a shorthand for power, legacy, and tragedy, a story with too many lessons to forget. But that's later. For now, close your eyes. Picture Constantinople under the moonlight, its mosaics glittering in candlelight, its domes echoing with hymns, its soldiers manning the walls for what they know may be the final time. Because in the East, the empire stood for 1,000 years longer, but it too would fade. Let's drift back west, shall we, to the lands where Rome once ruled directly, where the legions marched, where emperors once dined beneath painted ceilings and scribes copied decrees on wax tablets. But now it's different. The aqueducts are cracked, the colonnades are silent, and the streets that once bustled with toga-clad senators now echo with the sound of boots, not Roman ones. Because after the collapse of the Western Empire in 476 CE, what remained was not so much a clean slate as a messy patchwork. Italy, Gaul, Hispania, Britannia. They didn't suddenly disappear. They just changed hands. One province at a time, the lands of the Western Roman Empire were carved up by Germanic kingdoms. You could be born in what was once Roman Gaul, but now live under the Franks, or grow up in Spain under the Visigoths, or farmland in North Africa, now ruled by the Vandals. Yeah, and in every case, you might still call yourself Roman, because Rome wasn't a passport. It was a memory, but those memories had teeth. The new kings, many of whom had once served in the Roman army, weren't necessarily interested in destroying Rome's legacy. In fact, they often tried to preserve it. At least on the surface. They used Roman titles, issued Roman-style coins, even kept some Roman laws on the books. It was empire cosplay but with real swords. Odd fact, the Ostrogothic king, Theodoric the Great, who ruled Italy after Odoacer, dressed in Roman robes, ate Roman food, and appointed Roman officials. He couldn't read Latin himself, but he kept Roman culture alive by hiring people who could. This was the paradox. The barbarians who brought down Rome didn't actually want to erase it. They wanted to inherit it. But inheritance is tricky. The infrastructure, the real machinery of the empire, didn't last. Roads fell into disrepair. Trade routes fractured, tax collection collapsed, and most fatally, the state's ability to provide security and fadakut food, the two pillars of Roman power, crumbled. That's where our dominoes began to fall. Without tax revenue, city governments couldn't function. Without safe roads, commerce dwindled. Without commerce, money dried up. And without money, the military evaporated. What took its place? Localism. The world that followed the fall of Rome was not, as it's often labeled, a plunge into total darkness. But it was fragmented. Intensely so. People didn't think in terms of empire anymore. They thought in terms of manors, lords, villages, and churches. The imperial identity gave way to a feudal one. Power no longer flowed from a central state, but from personal relationships. You didn't serve the emperor, you served the lord, who controlled your patch of land, and occasionally your grain. And yet, the memory of Rome lingered. Everywhere you looked, Rome's ghost was visible. In the crumbling arches and amphitheaters reused as marketplaces or barns. In the old legal codes that kings still reference even when they didn't understand them. In the Latin language now splitting and evolving into what would become French, Spanish, Italian, and others. And most of all in the Patriarchate, because as the empire fell, the church rose. When Rome's administrative backbone snapped, the Christian clergy, especially the bishops, often stepped in. They administered cities, distributed food, settled disputes, and even negotiated with invading armies. The first Pope in Rome became one of the last authoritative figures with any cross-regional legitimacy. This is where the religious landscape back of Europe hardened into what we'd recognize today. Pagan temples were long abandoned or converted into churches. The rhythm of life became liturgical feast saints' days. But the church wasn't just a spiritual force, it was a political one. Bishops often came from wealthy families. They owned land, commanded loyalty, and even maintained private armies. And over time, they became the new aristocracy, one draped in vestments instead of togas. Historians still debate whether the church preserved Rome or replaced it. Probably both. It certainly aged, absorbed it. The Pope styled himself as a successor to St. Peter, but also very pointedly as the heir to Roman authority. There's a reason why centuries later, a man like Charlemagne would kneel before the Pope and be crowned Holy Roman Emperor, a title that was neither very holy nor very Roman, nor particularly an empire, but that didn't matter. The point was the claim, the idea, the odd fact. The Pope crowned Charlemagne on Christmas Day, 800 C. A ceremony carefully designed to echo the imperial grandeur of Rome. They even read out a fake document, the Donation of Constantine, which claimed the Roman emperor had gifted authority to the Pope centuries earlier. It was completely forged. Nobody cared. Power needs symbols, and nothing symbolized legitimacy like a Rome, but not everyone could access it. The ordinary people, the farmers, the craftsmen, the former Roman citizens now reclassified as peasants, they didn't spend their days pondering imperial nostalgia. They were busy surviving. And life was in many places brutal. Cities shrank. Some disappeared entirely. Literacy plummeted outside the clergy. Access to clean water, medical care, and food security fell sharply. Life expectancy declined. And while the term Dark Ages is now considered simplistic, it's fair to say that for many people things got measurably worse. That's not to say there weren't bright spots. In the monasteries, monks quietly preserved classical texts, copying Virgil and Cicero alongside psalms and hagiographies. In Ireland, illuminated manuscripts turned scripture into art. In southern Italy and Spain, Muslim scholars would later revive classical learning with a new twist, preserving and translating Greek texts long lost to the Latin West. But for now, in the 6th and 7th centuries, Western Europe was a shadow of its former self, and yet not entirely broken. Some Roman roads still connected villages, Roman walls still protected towns, and Roman identity, though now regional, diluted, and sometimes more symbolic than real, was still there. You could live in a half-collapsed villa, speak vulgar Latin, worship a Christian god in a church made of Roman stones, and still think of yourself as a citizen of a world that had ended 100 years before. That's the weird lingering magic of Rome. It doesn't die. It transforms. It becomes legend. It becomes aspiration. It becomes something to get back to, even if no one quite agrees on what back means. Because that's the thing about empires. They don't vanish like fireworks. They sink like glaciers, massive, slow, and reshaping everything as they go. And in the wreckage, something new starts growing. Tiny kingdoms, vernacular languages, monastic orders, new heroes, new stories. But beneath it all, the faint echo of a once unified world whispering from the ruins, still calling itself Rome. Let's look closer at the empire's military, because that's where so many of the threads begin to unravel, and oddly enough, where many Romans thought the solution might lie. After all, Rome wasn't built by bureaucrats and basilicas. It was built by legions. For centuries, the Roman army was the backbone of the empire, not just because it fought wars, but because it maintained roads, enforced taxes, built walls, cleared forests, even ran border towns. The legionary wasn't just a soldier, he was a civil engineer with a sword and some very impressive sandals. But by the late empire, that image had changed. The recruitment system had broken down. The traditional source of Roman manpower, Italian peasants, had dried up thanks to centuries of land consolidation, overtaxation, and the general experience of being alive in late antiquity. Many small farmers sold their land, fled to cities, or became effectively indentured to large landowners just to survive. So who filled the army's ranks? Foreigners. Lots of them. Germanic warriors, steppe horsemen, Syrian archers, Numidian cavalry. Some were paid mercenaries, others were members of federated tribes allowed to settle inside the empire in exchange for military service. Rome had always absorbed outsiders, but now the balance had shifted. The army was no longer Roman, it was Roman adjacent. At first, this wasn't seen as a disaster. Many of these recruits were loyal, skilled, and had a vested interest in defending their new homes. But over time, a slow transformation took place. Commanders from these backgrounds began to rise through the ranks. Loyalty shifted from the imperial office to individual generals. Pay became uncertain. Promotions became political. Discipline frayed. And then the federates. The tribal groups allowed to settle in Roman lands started asking for more. Land, autonomy, positions of power. Sometimes they're asked politely, sometimes with swords. Historians still debate whether the policy of federate settlement was a clever solution to Rome's manpower crisis or a slow-motion suicide pact. The answer probably is both. The most famous example is the Visigoths. You remember them: Alaric, sack of Rome, pepper ransom, etc. But before they became Rome's nightmare, they were Rome's guests. In 376 CE, they approached the Danube frontier seeking asylum from the Huns, a terrifying new force sweeping west from the steppes of Central Asia. The Romans let the Visigoths in, and then treated them like garbage. They were starved, extorted, exploited. Roman officials reportedly sold them dog meat at outrageous prices. The breaking point came quickly. By 378 CE, the Visigoths were in open revolt at the Battle of Adrianople. They didn't just win, they obliterated a Roman army and killed the sitting emperor. Valens. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history. 2/3 of the Eastern army wiped out in a single afternoon, And again, this wasn't some alien invader. These were people who'd been invited in. People who'd once fought for Rome. Odd fact. After Adrianople, the Visigoths weren't driven out. They were settled inside the empire with formal status, essentially as an autonomous kingdom within Roman borders. It was the political equivalent of losing a fistfight and then saying, okay, but what if you lived here now? And it set a precedent. From then on, more and more tribal groups were brought in and settled as semi-independent allies. Ostrogoths, Franks, Vandals, Burgundians. Some integrated better than others, but all of them weakened the central authority of the empire. Rome's borders became suggestions, and Roman control became increasingly negotiable. Meanwhile, the army itself became less and less reliable. There were still victories, still good commanders, but cohesion was gone, loyalty was fractured, and crucially, many of these barbarian troops and their commanders began to ask a perfectly logical question. Why serve the empire when you can rule a piece of it yourself? That's how you get men like Asilisat Pokeri Stilisho Skit after po Atresema Poko Aha Entergiki Odysser Octo non-Roman generals who effectively ran the empire through puppet emperors, or in Odoacer's case, they ended it entirely. The symbolism of Romulus Augustulus handing over his crown wasn't just about the collapse of an institution, it was the final step in a centuries-long process in which the military stopped being Roman debilitate and started being Rome. It's easy to forget how fast this change happened. In the 2nd century, a Roman soldier could march from Hadrian's Wall to the Euphrates and expect familiar road outposts, customs, and coins. By the 5th century, that same soldier might be from a Gothic tribe, fighting under a Frankish general paid in grain from a tax base that no longer existed, and quartered in a province that hadn't seen a Roman administrator in years. The institutional skeleton of the empire still stood, but the flesh had long since changed. And the final irony, even as these new rulers took over, they still clung to the symbols of Roman legitimacy. They minted coins with Roman emperors on them. They kept Roman laws. They wore Roman-style cloaks and signed edicts in Latin. To rule in the post-Roman world, you had to look Roman, because that was still the brand. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was nostalgia weaponized. In a world unraveling, the image of Rome still had power. So kings and warlords draped themselves in its faded glory even as they dismantled it brick by brick. The people meanwhile adapted. If you lived in Gaul or Hispania or Italy in the 400s, your world was changing fast but also very slowly. The taxman stopped showing up. Your town might now answer to a Gothic lord. The markets got quieter, the roads less traveled. But you still went to church, you still prayed in Latin, you still called the calendar by the names of Roman months, even if July, named for Julius Caesar, now arrived with less bread and more uncertainty. Oddly enough, the decline was so gradual in many places that people didn't even notice it was happening. No one stood on a rooftop and shouted, "Rome has fallen." Instead, they asked quieter questions like, why hasn't the grain ship arrived this month? Why are there no teachers anymore? Why does the village down the river speak a different language now? Why does the bishop have a private army? Why does my son want to become a monk instead of a soldier? And that's how empires end, not in fire but in fog. By the time anyone really understood what had happened, it was already memory. And memory, as we've seen, is one of Rome's most durable exports. Let's wander for a moment into what's left behind after an empire dies. Not the monuments, not the dusty records of laws no one follows anymore. No, let's talk about people. Real people breathing, people who once called themselves Roman and noun, aren't quite sure what they are anymore. The collapse of central authority didn't leave a vacuum, it left 1,000 little fires, each flickering into something new. For some, that fire meant freedom. For others, it meant losing everything that made life bearable. In the cities, those once glorious centers of Roman order, the lights went out slowly. Aqueducts cracked. Forums emptied, baths grew cold, then dry, then mossy. The great libraries of the Western Empire either burned or were forgotten. Some buildings were dismantled stone by stone, their marble hauled away to build churches or palaces for the new local warlord, Rome itself. The Eternal City survived technically, but it was no longer the seat of an empire. It was a city of ghosts, of memory. Senators still wore their togas, but now they were petitioning bishops instead of emperors. Once decisions made in Rome had thundered across continents, now the city barely managed to feed itself. Odd fact, by the 6th century, wild animals were spotted roaming inside the walls of Rome. Not metaphorically actual animals. Boars in the Forum, wolves in the aqueduct tunnels, a quiet animal reclaiming of the city. And the countryside. It became the new heart of power. With the empire gone, wealthy landowners turned their villas into self-sufficient estates. These weren't the luxury pleasure palaces of the past, but fortified manors, walls, gates, guards, the latifundia. Rome's old system of plantation-like estates morphed into early feudalism. Peasants, once free citizens, increasingly tied themselves to these estates not officially as slaves, but in all the ways that mattered. If you worked the land, you owed labor a share of your crop, and probably your firstborn to your landlord. But hey, at least the landlord fed you, sometimes. It was security over freedom, a trade many were willing to make as trade routes collapsed and banditry soared. The world had grown smaller, scarier. You stuck with the local strongman who had a well and a wall. Historians still debate whether this transformation was inevitable or opportunistic. Some say feudalism was Rome's last gift to Europe, a fallback plan when the imperial system proved unsustainable. Others see it as a betrayal, a regression from citizenship to serfdom. Maybe it was both. Meanwhile, in the north, new cultures were blooming. The Franks breed in Gaul were establishing a kingdom that would one day become France. The eclectic Anglo-Saxons had taken root in Britain, carving up the old Roman province into warring petty kingdoms. The Angles, Visigoths, ruled in Spain, with kings trying their best to dress like Caesars even as they argued over tribal succession. And in the east, Byzantium, Deridini still claimed to be Rome, just a more complicated, more theological, more bejeweled version of it. But none of these places could claim what Rome once had, a sense of universality. Puisque fact, the feeling that the world was one interconnected thing, bound by law's roads and shared identity. That was gone. And yet even in this fractured landscape, Rome didn't vanish. It lived on in strange places. Take law, for example. Even after Rome's collapse, its legal system, the careful, obsessive, hyper-literate Roman tradition of statutes, contracts, and civil procedures, kept circulating in dusty manuscripts across Europe. Monks and scholars copied it. Kings borrowed from it. And in the 11th century, long after the empire was rubble, the Zicurtates Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, was rediscovered in Italy and became the foundation of modern European law. Or take language. The Latin of Cicero and Virgil broke apart, evolved, hybridized, but it didn't die. It gave birth to repertory French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian. Every time someone in Madrid orders vino, or someone in Milan calls their mother mama, or a child in Marseille counts un, deux, trois, they're speaking Rome reshaped. Even the calendar that you're using right now, that's Roman. January is named for Janus, the god of doorways. July is named for Julius Caesar. The 7-day week, a Roman mashup of planetary gods and bureaucratic efficiency. Rome may have lost the world, but it held on to time. And then there's the biggest survivor of all the Christian church. If Rome's political structures cracked under pressure, the church absorbed the impact. It adapted. It grew. Bishops filled the power vacuum. Monasteries became centers of learning. The papacy transformed from a local Roman bishopric into the spiritual head of Christendom. And because Christianity had been shaped by Rome, it had preserved the Rome. The rituals, the titles, the vestments, the church kept them alive. Pontifex Maximus, once a pagan title, was now the Pope's. Church councils met in old Roman cities. Latin remained the sacred language even as fewer and fewer people understood it. Odd fact, the Vatican seat of the modern church still uses Latin on official documents. In fact, they even have a Latin Twitter account. Rome never tweets, but if it did, it would be in perfect grammar. In this strange hybrid post-Roman world, one thing became clear. Rome was too useful to let die. Even those who helped tear it down couldn't quite let go. Barbarian kings kept Roman administrators. They took Roman names. They married into Roman families. Some even styled themselves as Rex Romanorum, King of the Romans. There's something quietly tragic about it. They destroyed the empire, and then tried to with it. But imitation is not resurrection. The systems were gone, the roads unpatrolled, the schools closed, the imperial court silent. And as the centuries passed, something else faded, memory. By the 8th and 9th centuries, ordinary people no longer remembered what the empire had really been like. They knew of Rome as an idea, a golden age, a time when roads were smooth and laws were fair, and the gods, or now God, protected the righteous. Rome became a myth of order, a myth of greatness, a myth of what had been lost and might one day return. Every empire that followed would invoke it. The Holy Roman Empire in Germany, the Papal States in Italy, the Ottoman sultans who called themselves Caesars after taking Constantinople, the Russian Tsars, Caesars in Slavic. Even the American founding fathers borrowed Roman architecture, Roman titles, and Roman virtues. The Capitol building in Washington, D.C., that dome, those columns, pure Rome. Because Rome, even when it was long dead, still meant something. It meant power, it meant law, it meant greatness. It also meant fragility, a reminder that no matter how strong an empire feels, no matter how many roads it builds, or laws it writes, or coins it mints, it can still fall. Not with a bang, not all at once, but slowly, like a city forgetting its own name. By now the story of Rome's fall is feeling less like a single event and more like a long, slow exhale, a drawn-out twilight that took generations to dim. But if we're honest, it's not even fair to call it a fall. Rome didn't fall, it faded, it scattered. It wandered off in pieces and remade itself in different costumes. And no costume was more ironic or more haunting than the one worn by the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. Yes, you heard that right. Romulus, like the mythical founder of Rome, suckled by wolves and raised to glory. Augustulus, literally Little Augustus, a nickname dripping with diminishment. It was as if history was winking. The empire had begun with Romulus, son of Mars, builder of walls, and now it would end with Romulus Augustulus, a teenage puppet in a broken palace in Ravenna, blinking in the candlelight while barbarian mercenaries surrounded his city. Let's rewind to 475 CE. The real power wasn't Romulus, it was his father, Orestes, a former secretary to Attila, the Hun turned Roman general. When Orestes overthrew the previous emperor and installed his young son as figurehead, it wasn't about glory, it was about control. Romulus was convenient, harmless, decorative, and for a brief moment the Western Roman Empire had an emperor again, sort of. But the empire wasn't really there anymore. Gaul had slipped into the hands of the Franks. Spain was a patchwork of Extor, Visigothic, and Eburn, Suebi, Orid holdings. North Africa was ruled by the Abulburi Adavandals, who sent pirates across the Mediterranean like bad holiday postcards. Britain, long gone abandoned by Rome decades earlier, now a battleground between all Anglo-Saxons and scattered Romano-British holdouts. The Western Emperor, whoever he was, controlled Italy. And even that was generous. Really, it was Ravenna and its immediate surroundings. The rest answered to whoever had the biggest sword and the smallest conscience. Meanwhile, the Roman army, if it could still be called, that was a patchwork of Germanic mercenaries. Tribal warriors who had once served the empire faithfully, but who now wanted land. Not just pay, not just plunder. Land. They had fought Rome's battles. Now they wanted their reward. Orestes said no, which in hindsight was bold. The response, Odoger, a Germanic general of mixed heritage, likely part Syrian, part Hunnic, part. I'm done being polite. Odoacer rallied the disaffected troops, defeated Orestes in battle, and marched on Ravenna. Romulus, still barely old enough to shave, was captured. And here's the thing, Odoacer didn't kill him. He saw no point in killing a boy whose crown was made of cobwebs. Instead, he spared us. Romulus granted him a pension and sent him off to live in comfortable exile in Capua e Campania. According to some sources, Romulus lived quietly for years, afterward tending a villa near Naples, watching the world forget him. That was it. No final battle, no martyrdom, just a quiet retirement and a shrug. But Odoacer wasn't done. In a final act of symbolic closure, he took the imperial regalia, the crown, the scepter, the purple robe, and sent them to Emperor Zeno. In Constantinople, the ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire. Message received, we don't need a Western emperor anymore. Zeno agreed. No new emperor was appointed, the title dissolved. The year was 476 CE, and historians ever fond of round numbers and narrative symmetry would later choose this as the official fall of the Western Roman Empire. Odd fact, there was no such thing as 476 CE at the time. That dating system, Anno Domini, wasn't in common use yet. So the fall of Rome didn't even know it was the fall of Rome. Most people didn't either, because for the average person in Italy or Gaul or Spain, nothing changed overnight. Taxes were still collected just by different men. Armies still patrolled just under different flags. Churches still held mass. Bread still baked in ovens. The empire like a ghost kept walking long after it died. But now it wore new faces. Odoacer ruled Italy as Rex Italiae, king of Italy, acknowledging the Eastern Emperor nominally, but answering to no one in practice. He preserved much of the Roman bureaucracy, employed Roman administrators, and kept things moving with surprisingly little disruption. You could argue that his government functioned better than the last 5 emperors put together. And still he was a barbarian, a word that had once meant not Greek, then not Roman, and now meant everyone who isn't us. Which raises a strange question. If a government runs like Rome, governs like Rome, and looks like Rome, but the guy in charge is named Odoacer, is it still Rome? The answer increasingly was no, because even as the machinery of empire limped on, the idea of Rome had shattered. There was no longer a single power that could claim universality, no center to orbit, no common tongue, no common vision, no unifying myth. What replaced it was kaleidoscopic. Tiny kingdoms, local dukes, tribal alliances, monasteries doubling as town halls, the church becoming a state within a state. And most of all, a continent waiting for someone to fill the void, because history abhors a vacuum. In the east, the Byzantine emperors kept the flame alive, but in the west, the race was on who would inherit the prestige of Rome. The Franks have tried, so did the Lombards, or the Visigoths, even the early popes, but it was a man named Charlemagne, 2 centuries later, who would claim the mantle most boldly. In 800 CE, on Christmas Day, in a calculated piece of political theatre, Pope Leo III placed a crown on Charlemagne's head and declared him Holy Roman Emperor. The crowd roared, trumpets blared, Latin choruses sang. Never mind that the original empire had collapsed. Never mind that the Byzantines still claimed to be the real deal. Charlemagne had the church, the sword, and the narrative. Rome was reborn, or rather reimagined. But that's the thing about Rome. It never really dies. It just gets rebranded. So here's where we are 10 parts into our gentle tumble through the centuries. The Western Empire is gone. The Eastern Empire endures. The church is rising. The barbarians are kings. And a boy named Romulus walks alone through a garden in Campania, the last Roman emperor alive but irrelevant. And all across the former empire, people whisper stories of how things used to be, of warm baths and cold coins, of legions and libraries, of an empire that seemed too vast to fall, until it did. The strangest thing about legacies is how they grow stronger after death. Rome in its final Western days was pitiful. Shrinking borders, puppet emperors, Gothic warlords calling the shots behind crumbling palace walls, and yet give it a generation or two, and suddenly everyone wanted to be Rome again, because even in death, Rome had something priceless: mythology. Not just the religious kind, but the political kind, the story of a world that once worked, that had roads laws, schools peace, Pax Romana, the good old days, and nowhere was that longing stronger than in the so-called Dark Ages. Now, to be fair to the Middle Ages, historians today kind of hate that term Dark Ages. It's dramatic, sure, but misleading. There were plenty of lights still burning in monasteries in city-states in the Islamic world and the Eastern Empire. Still in the West, things felt darker, smaller, less certain. So the memory of Rome became more than just history. It became a compass. And the person gripping that compass the tightest, the Christian church. When the Western Empire disintegrated, the church didn't. In fact, it expanded, all filling the vacuum left behind by collapsing governments. Bishops became civic leaders, monks became scribes, popes became power brokers, and Latin, once the language of bureaucracy and emperors, became the language of God. The Pope in Rome wasn't just another bishop anymore. He became the bishop, the successor of St. Peter, keeper of apostolic tradition, and unofficially the new emperor of the West. Odd fact, by the 7th century, the Pope had his own army, not a symbolic one, a real force. Armed men loyal to the church, defending its territories, fighting off Lombards and other intruders. You could get excommunicated and stabbed. It was a two-pronged approach. And as the Pope's authority grew, so did the idea that only he could anoint true kings. That if you wanted legitimacy, if you wanted to rule like a Caesar, you needed the church's blessing. Enter Charlemagne, king of the Franks, conqueror of half of Europe, and a man with a vision, not just of land and borders, but of renewal, of rebuilding the Roman Empire as a Christian order with himself at the top and God as his co-pilot. Christmas Day in the year 800, as he knelt in prayer at St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo III snuck up behind him supposedly unannounced and placed a golden crown on his head. Charles Augustus crowned by the God Emperor of the Romans. Trumpets, chanting, a literal choir of angels, or at least a trained chorus of monks. And just like that, a new Roman Empire was born. On paper anyway. Historians still debate whether Charlemagne knew this was going to happen. Some sources claim he was surprised. Others say he orchestrated the whole affair down to the incense count. Either way, the symbolism was clear. Rome had returned. But had it? Charlemagne ruled from Mifashen, not Rome. He spoke a Germanic dialect, not Latin. His empire was Christian, yes, but decentralized. A collection of kingdoms and counties loosely bound by loyalty to the man at the top, and only as long as he kept winning. Still, he tried. He reformed the currency, standardizing a silver-based system that would outlast him by centuries. He launched an education revival, establishing cathedral schools and copying ancient texts. He issued laws based on old Roman principles, even if half his counts couldn't read them. And most importantly, he wrapped it all in the trappings of Rome togas, seals, title ceremonies. Rome wasn't dead, it was in costume. But even Charlemagne couldn't escape the laws of entropy. When he died in 814, his empire passed to his son Louis the Pious, and from there to Louis's sons, who promptly fought each other into oblivion. By the mid-800s, the empire had fractured into what would eventually become France, Germany, and Italy, separate kingdoms with shared ancestry and mutual suspicion. And the imperial title, it lingered, awkwardly, uneasily, carried by a succession of kings who styled themselves as Holy Roman Emperors. It's often joked that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman, nor an empire. And honestly, that's pretty accurate. The emperors were elected, not born. The territory shifted constantly. And by the High Middle Ages, Roman meant connected to the Pope and some old documents, not builder of roads and legions. Still, the idiot mattered, because in medieval Europe, power came not from having land or troops, but from having a story, a justification, a myth. And Rome had the best myth. So kings kept borrowing it. Popes kept invoking it. Even Islamic rulers in Spain and North Africa sometimes compared themselves to Caesar, just to add polish to their legitimacy. Odd fact: the Islamic city of Cordoba, under the Umayyads, was often described by Muslim poets as the New Rome. Its libraries, hospitals, and baths rivaled anything found in the old empire. Roman architecture, Roman engineering, but with minarets and algebra. And still, the real Rome, the city like, was declining. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the once great capital had become a kind of sacred ruin. Popes squabbled with local nobles. Saracen pirates raided the coast. The Senate met only in theory. Its population had shrunk to a fraction of what it had been. Ancient temples were crumbling. The Forum was now a cow pasture. Visitors from the north wrote of Rome with awe and pity, walking among the broken columns like tourists in a forgotten museum. The Colosseum stood, but it was partly collapsed, its stones cannibalized for other buildings. The Pantheon was now a church. Rome the city had become Rome the relic. And yet, Rome the symbol had never been stronger. Every monastery that copied a Latin text, every church that held a mass in the Roman rite, every emperor who claimed Caesar's mantle, every law code that referenced Justinian, every scholar who quoted Cicero or Seneca, they were all keeping Rome alive, not as a place, but as an idea, an empire of the mind. And that idea had power, not the kind that commands armies or taxes provinces, but the kind that shapes dreams just before you fall asleep, that whispers to kings, priests, poets, and peasants. We were once more than this. We could be again, even as the world shifted, feudal castles rising where legions once marched, cathedrals replacing temples, knights jousting where senators debated the image of Rome, glowed on like embers under ash. And those embers, they were waiting for the next generation to breathe on them, to reignite the myth, to try once again to become Rome. By now, the fall of Rome sounds more like a slow-motion metamorphosis than a single historical event. What began as the collapse of a political empire had become something stranger, a cultural haunting. Rome had vanished, and yet it had not. It had left its fingerprints on everything. And as the Middle Ages trudged forward, those fingerprints only deepened. But where do we go from here? Let's head north to the British Isles, where Rome's shadow lingered in an even more fractured form. When the Roman legions withdrew from Britannia. To around 410 CE, the island didn't so much fall as Hoppo unravelably Watherasto. Roman towns were abandoned, villas were stripped for stone, trade with the continent slowed to a trickle, and in the vacuum new powers rose. Angles, Saxons, and immutable tribes from across the sea who brought with them new languages, new gods, and very different priorities. The Romano-British elite tried to hold on. Some became petty kings. Some fled to Wales, Urabul, or Labour, Brittany. Some became legends like King Arthur, whose real-life counterpart may have been a Romanized warlord clinging to the old order with fading dignity. Odd fact. Early medieval Welsh poetry often refers to Rome with reverence even after it had abandoned the island. To be a Roman was still to be civilized even as wild new kingdoms emerged from the misty woods. But Rome's legacy in Britain was not about statues or currency. It was about memory. Monasteries preserved fragments of Latin literacy. Place names like Chester, Gloucester, and Colchester still bore the suffix Chester from castra, meaning military camp. Meanwhile, on the continent, the situation was no less tangled. Let's go back to Italy, where the concept of Rome became even more complicated. After the fall of the Western Empire and Odoacer's brief reign, Italy didn't slide into chaos. Not immediately. In fact, it was conquered by another Romanized barbarian, Theodoric the Great, king of the East Ostrogoths. Besdur, a man who had been raised in Constantinople, spoke fluent Greek, and liked to quote Roman philosophers before breakfast. Theodoric ruled with tact and ambition. He kept Roman senators in place, maintained the infrastructure, issued edicts in Latin. In many ways, he was a better Roman than the Romans. He wanted unity between Goths and Italians, between tradition and transformation. And for a few decades it worked. But then came Justinian. Back in Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Emperor had had enough. To him, the West wasn't a lost cause, it was stolen property. And Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565 CE, saw it as his divine mission to restore the Roman Empire in its full glory. So he launched the Gothic Wars, a series of brutal, prolonged campaigns to retake Italy from the Ostrogoths. His general Belisarius succeeded eventually. Rome changed hands 5 times during the conflict. Cities were besieged, populations decimated, entire regions depopulated. By the time the Byzantines won, Italy was a shattered shell. Justinian had reclaimed the land and then destroyed it in the process. It was a Pyrrhic victory. Rome had been restored by laying it to waste. And it didn't last. Within a few decades, the Lombards, another Germanic tribe, swept in and claimed much of northern and central Italy. The Byzantines held onto fragments Ravenna, some coastal cities, but the dream of a unified empire was gone. Still, Justinian had done something else, something longer lasting than conquest. He compiled Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, or body of civil law, was a sweeping, comprehensive codification of centuries of Roman statutes, legal opinions, and imperial decrees. It organized chaos, it created clarity, and it would go on to influence every major legal system in Europe, directly or indirectly. Even today, echoes of Justinian's code appear in modern law, from French civil codes to German legal doctrine to the very concept of innocent until proven guilty. Odd fact, law students in the Middle Ages learned Roman legal terms in Latin even if they didn't understand a word of what they were saying. Latin had become the language of authority, even when comprehension lagged behind. So even as the Western Empire disintegrated, Roman law marched on. Not enforced by emperors anymore, but by scholars, popes, and kings who wanted the legitimacy of antiquity, without the burden of maintaining an empire. And then there were the roads up, yes, the literal ones. Built to last, they endured even as the empire crumbled around them. In the post-Roman world, merchants still used them, armies still marched down them, pilgrims still walked them, heading to shrines and cathedrals. Overgrown, cracked, sometimes covered by new layers of earth, but they were still there, a reminder that Rome had once connected the world, and in some small way still did. It's easy to forget how revolutionary that had been. Before Rome, most people rarely traveled more than a few miles from where they were born, but Rome built roads across mountains, through forests, into deserts, a web of connectivity that shrank the world. After the empire fell, that web frayed down but didn't disappear. In some regions, especially southern France and northern Italy, Roman infrastructure outlived the emperors by centuries. There's something poetic about that. The road stayed long after the rhetoric faded. And then there was the idea of unity, that more than any building or coin or edict was Rome's most enduring export. Because once you've lived in an empire, once you've seen the advantages of shared laws, common currency, protected borders, postal systems, food distribution, education, entertainment, you don't forget. You miss it, you want it back. And so for centuries after its fall, every ambitious ruler in Europe tried to resurrect it. Not out of nostalgia, out of necessity. They saw what Rome had accomplished and thought, why not again? The Franks tried, the Germans tried, the Byzantines tried, even Napoleon tried. They all failed. Because Rome wasn't just a government, it was a moment, A unique collision of geography, technology, economics, and sheer absurd ambition. It can't be replicated, not exactly, but it can be impersonated. And that's exactly what happened over and over again. Which brings us to a final strange twist in the tale. Even barbarian kings, the very men who helped destroy the Western Empire, used Roman iconography. They minted coins with Latin inscriptions, wore Roman-style tunics, gave their sons Roman names, married Roman noblewomen. They didn't just want to conquer Rome, they wanted to liberate Rome. Because Rome had become more than a city, more than a system. It was now a mirror into which every civilization since has looked and wondered with a mix of awe and dread. Are we Rome? You've heard that question before. You've probably asked it yourself late at night while scrolling through some gloomy news story or sitting in a history class taught by a slightly too dramatic professor. Are we Rome? The answer, of course, is not exactly boop, but also solid, well, because Rome isn't just a cautionary tale, it's the cautionary tale. When things fall apart, when the roads crack and the center no longer holds, when the rhetoric grows louder than the action and the weight of the state collapses under its own bloat, Rome is always there at the back of our minds whispering, this has happened before. But let's not jump too far ahead. Before Rome became our favorite metaphor for decline, it became something else first, something more fragile, more human, a memory that was as much about what was lost as what was ever truly built. Because after the emperors were gone and the senators silenced and the marble faded into moss, what lingered was not glory, but yearning. People taught Mr. Rome. Not just the empire, but the feeling of being part of something big, something organized, something predictable. An empire might oppress you, but at least it's consistent. It has aqueducts, it has census records, it has law. The world that replaced Rome, especially in the West, was anything but consistent. It was confusing. Tribal boundaries shifting like tides, power based on personalities, not policies. A world where today's ally was tomorrow's raider and kings rose not by law, but by luck, bloodline, or brute force. So even as new kingdoms formed and new languages emerged, people kept reaching back. You could see it in the architecture. Churches built in the shape of Roman basilicas, fortresses reusing Roman bricks, cities tracing their walls along the footprint of Roman castra military camps, long since abandoned but still etched into the ground like scars. You could see it in literature too. Writers from the 7th century onward peppered their Latin prose with references to Cicero and Virgil, even when the world they lived in bore no resemblance to the golden age they were quoting. It's a bit like using Shakespearean English in a fast food drive-through, charming, archaic, slightly tragic. Odd fact. In the early medieval period, many scribes didn't actually understand the Latin they were copying. They just copied it anyway. Letter for letter, mistake for mistake. It wasn't about comprehension, it was about preservation. They didn't want to lose the words, they trusted the future to figure it out. And eventually the future did, because somewhere between the cracked scrolls and the overgrown aqueducts, a spark caught fire. We call it the Renaissance, a word that literally means rebirth. But what it really was at its heart was a rediscovery. A moment when Europe, still recovering from plague, still reeling from war, still squabbling over church doctrine and dynastic claims, looked back and said, wait, didn't we used to be better than this? So they dusted off old manuscripts, they studied Roman statues, copied Roman columns, revived Roman ideals, and in doing so, they reawakened something dormant. Artists like Michelangelo sculpted like the ancients. Architects like Brunelleschi rebuilt domes that hadn't graced skylines since Constantine's day. Writers like Petrarch, Appice, and Machiavelli praised Roman virtues and, yes, Roman vices. Even popes got in on the act, commissioning frescoes and libraries, declaring themselves spiritual heirs, not just to Peter and Paul, but to Caesar and Augustus. The Vatican a new Rome for a new era. But don't let the grandeur fool you. The Renaissance didn't bring Rome back. It brought Rome's memory back, its aesthetics, its philosophy, its contradictions. Because Rome had always been two things at once. It was the Republic, virtuous, civic-minded, built on shared ideals. And it was also the empire ruthless, hierarchical, obsessed with control and conquest. The Renaissance admired both, sometimes without realizing the tension, and that tension carried forward into the Enlightenment, when thinkers used Roman ideas of law and governance to challenge monarchies, into the founding of the United States, one where a group of revolutionaries inspired by Roman republicanism built a government with a senate, a capital, and even a veto Latin for I forbid. George Washington was often likened to Cincinnatus, the Roman farmer general, who laid down his power after saving the state. That's why Washington gave up the presidency after 2 terms, because Cincinnatus had done it first. Even the architecture in Washington, D.C. reflects this obsession. White domes, tall columns, buildings designed to echo the Forum, to whisper, this too is Rome. And yet, the comparison is never perfect. Because while the Roman Republic inspired democratic ideals, the Roman Empire has always loomed as a warning of what happens when expansion overtakes principle, when a power outgrows accountability. When comfort dulls civic virtue, and bread and circuses become substitutes for engagement and sacrifice. Historians still debate what exactly caused Rome's fall. Was it economic collapse, military overreach, environmental decline, political rot, religious upheaval, external invasion? The answer is yes, all of it. It wasn't one crack in the foundation. It was 1,000 hairline fractures, spreading year after year until the weight of it all simply became too much. The West broke first. The East held on brilliantly, stubbornly for 1,000 more years. But even Byzantium fell eventually. In 1453, Constantinople's walls that had withstood Persians, Goths, Arabs, Bulgars, Crusaders, finally broke under the cannons of the Ottoman Turks, the last Roman emperor. Constantine the Cinque reportedly tore off his imperial regalia and vanished into the fray. His body was never found. Just like the first Romulus disappeared into legend, the last Constantine dissolved into myth, and the empire gone, at least officially. But Rome never really went away. It became an echo, repeating through centuries, a mirror, as we said before, in which every generation sees itself reflected, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with fear, and always with the question, are we next? Odd fact. As late as the 18th century, some European nobles still listed Roman Empire among their titles, even though no emperor had ruled from Rome in over a millennium. It just sounded good. It made them feel important, because Rome at its core was importance itself. The weight of the world concentrated into one name, one myth, one set of broken ruins that still towers over us. So as we near the end of our journey, remember this. Rome didn't fall in a day, and it doesn't stay fallen. It rises again and again, not as an empire, but as an idea. And like all powerful ideas, it can guide or deceive. It can inspire us to greatness or lull us into complacency. It can teach us to build aqueducts, write laws, sculpt beauty, or distract us with the empty grandeur of forums filled with nothing but dust. The choice then, as now, is ours. The sun is low now, casting long shadows across the ruins. A silence hangs in the air, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through broken columns. Rome, for all its noise in life, went down, quietly. There was no final trumpet, no curtain drawn, no narrator saying, "This is the end." It was a slow, uneven dimming, a light flickering through the fog, fading one lamp at a time. And yet here we are, centuries later, still watching that glow. Let's wander once more through what was left behind, not just in monuments and manuscripts, but in memory, because if there's one thing Rome gave the world besides aqueducts and law codes, it was an unshakable sense that this mattered. The world after Rome didn't just live with the empire's loss, it absorbed, don't it? Like soil after a fire, it grew new things from the ashes. And like any good compost pile, it was messy. Take the monasteries, for example. Those quiet, candlelit places tucked in mountain valleys and wooded hillsides, places where monks in coarse wool robes rose before dawn, copied scrolls by hand, baked their own bread, and tried against the entropy of time to remember. Tundir. Much of what we know about classical Rome, its literature, philosophy, science survived because monks copied it. Sometimes faithfully, sometimes with doodles in the margins, sometimes mixing up sentences, but they preserved it even when no one was reading it. Odd fact. In some medieval manuscripts you'll find tiny drawings of knights fighting snails, rabbits jousting with lances, or monks in dance battles with demons. The margins may have been quiet, but the imaginations were not. And while they wrote Europe slowly rebuilt, it wasn't linear. There were still wars, famines, and plagues, but over time, towns grew, trade routes reopened, markets returned, cathedrals rose where temples had once stood. And from the quiet pulse of learning and labor came something unexpected. A new civilization. Not Roman, not quite, but undeniably shaped by Rome's skeleton. You could see it in the soprattutto laws or now drawn from Justinian's Codex, in the choice architecture with arches and domes returning in the language still rooted in Latin roots and Roman rhythm, in the very concept of lo universality, that the world could in theory be united by common ideas. And nowhere did that memory weigh heavier than in the minds of our kings. Medieval monarchs styled themselves not just as rulers of men, but as heirs to a lost world, a better world, one of order, stability, greatness. Roma Aeterna. They quoted Roman authors in court. They gave their children Roman names. They crowned themselves in ceremonies designed to echo the Caesars. Even the Crusades, for all their chaos and carnage, were wrapped in Roman dressings. Pope Urban II, calling knights to Jerusalem in 1095, used the language of imperial mission, marching east, not just to reclaim the Holy Land, but to restore the West's dignity. The Byzantine emperor at the time, Alexios, hoped to get some hired help. What he got instead was an army of Europeans, convinced they were the new Roman legions. That's the thing about myth, it's infectious. And Rome had become the most contagious myth of all. You see it in Russia too. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Russian Tsars, Caesars, declared Moscow the Third Rome. The first had fallen to barbarians, the second to Muslims, but the third would endure. Orthodox Christianity, imperial autocracy, and grand architecture, all wrapped in Byzantine legacy and Roman ambition. They weren't alone. Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804, deliberately invoking Roman glory. His civil code borrowed heavily from Roman law. His eagle banners, his obsession with classical columns, even his hairstyles, they all screamed, "Look at me, I'm Caesar." Later, fascist Italy. Under Mussolini, did the same, parading through Rome in togas, restoring ancient forums and claiming the new Roman Empire had returned. Spoiler, it hadn't. And then there's America. The United States, for all its forward-looking energy, is built on Roman bones. We have a Senate, a Capitol, an executive veto, a republic designed to balance power with checks, balances and Latin mottos carved into marble. But de pluribus unum, out of many one. That's not just American. That's Roman, the republic reborn with better plumbing and hopefully fewer assassinations. Even the architecture of Washington, D.C., its white domes, grand steps, imposing facades, is a love letter to the Roman Forum dressed in neoclassical drag. But of course, as we've seen, Rome was never just a model. It was a warning, because Rome fell. It fell slowly, painfully, unevenly, but it fell. And every generation that remembers it is haunted by the question, could we fall too? And here's where things get quiet again. Because the lessons of Rome aren't loud. They're not shouted from podiums. They don't wear golden laurels or march down cobbled roads. They're whispered like a bedtime story you're not sure you should tell your children. They're in the moments when citizens stop voting because it feels pointless. When the rich get richer and the poor get priced out of bread. When armies are no longer loyal to nations but to individuals. When borders stretch too far. When the center can't keep up with the edges. When the stories we tell ourselves no longer match the realities we live in. Historians still debate the moment Rome was truly lost. Was it when the currency collapsed, when the legions lost discipline, when the emperors became figureheads, when the people stopped caring? Or was it simply a change of mood, a sense that the future was no longer Roman, that the best days were behind? And yet, even in the darkest years, someone always tried to rebuild, to hold onto the fragments, to light a candle in the ruins and whisper, it's not over. And in a way, it never was. Because as long as someone writes laws, builds roads, teaches history, or stares at a ruined column, and dreams of something better, Rome endures. Not in power, but in possibility, and that's why the story still matters. Not because we'll become Rome, but because we're always standing somewhere between what Rome was and what it meant, between greatness and hubris, between order and decay, between empire and idea. And so as we prepare to say good night to Rome, to leave its shadowed streets and crumbling arches, we do so not in fear, but in reverence. Because in its rise, we saw what humans could build. And in its fall, we saw how easily it can slip away. So here we are, the final stretch of the longest, slowest, most beautifully crumbling empire the world has ever known. We've walked through its marble streets, sat in its decaying amphitheaters, watched emperors crown themselves in desperation, and now we stand at the end Rome not as a power but as a memory stitched into the very fabric of civilization. You might expect the final chapter to be dramatic flames licking the skyline legions crushed in their last stand, a final scream from the Senate floor. But Rome, like all tired giants, didn't go out screaming. It went out sighing. By the 1400s, the last thread of imperial continuity was fraying in Constantinople, the great bastion of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Byzantines, descendants of the Caesars in every legal sense, were now a tiny Christian kingdom clinging to a single city, surrounded by the rising tide of the Ottoman Turks. Once their empire stretched from Spain to Syria. Now it was 3 city districts and a nervous emperor named Turgamius Constantine Inxe Palaiologos. That's it. But even then, even in its final hours, Constantinople still bore the signs of old Rome. Its churches glowed with golden mosaics. Its scholars quoted Aristotle. Its imperial guards still marched in the shadow of walls built 1,000 years earlier under the reign of Theodosius. The Ottomans, led by the 21-year-old Mehmed II, laid siege in April 1453. They brought cannons, massive clanking monsters that shook the earth. The Byzantines had walls, bravery, faith, but no reinforcements. On May 29th, after 53 days, the walls were breached. The last Roman emperor donned his purple robe, addressed his soldiers, and vanished into the melee. His body was never found. Just like the first Romulus who vanished into myth, the last Constantine did the same. The circle closed, and the city, the new Rome, was conquered, but not erased. The Ottomans respected Constantinople's importance. They renamed it Istanbul they preserved many of its buildings. Hagia Sophia, once the crown jewel of Byzantine Christianity, became a mosque, its domes echoing now with the call to prayer, instead of Latin hymns. Odd fact, Mehmed II took the title Caesar Irum, Caesar of Rome. He believed he had inherited the empire, not destroyed it. And in a way he had, because Rome had never really been about marble or borders. It had always been about authority. The right to rule, to name things, to decide what civilization looks like. And that power kept traveling. Even as the true empire fell, the idea of Rome was passed like a torch. To Moscow, where the Tsars claimed to be the Third Rome. To Vienna, capital of the Holy Roman Empire, where Habsburg emperors clung to titles older than their own castles. To London. Paris. Washington, D.C. All cities built on the bones of Roman ambition. You can still see it today. In courtrooms where judges wear robes and quote habeas corpus. In cities laid out in grids with roads built on top of Roman ones. In the words we speak, justice, liberty, Senate, republic. In our architecture, our art, even our fears. Because Rome also left us a question whispered, never answered. Will we last? Because if Rome could fall, anything can... And Rome fell. Yes, slowly, but still. It lost touch with its core values. It overreached. It overtaxed. It forgot why it started. Its citizens stopped believing in it. Its elites hoarded wealth. Its military turned inward. Its leaders grew decadent, paranoid, performative. Sound familiar? It should. Because every civilization stares at Rome like a mirror. Not because they're identical, but because the reflection feels so uncomfortably close. Pukaka. And yet, this isn't just a cautionary tale. Rome was also a triumph. Think of what it built, what it achieved, what it dreamed into existence. A republic based on law centuries before democracy became fashionable. Roads stretching over mountains and deserts built so precisely they still exist. A common currency, a postal system, universal citizenship, at least in theory. A city where people of every background, every race, every religion mingled, argued, traded, and fell in love under marble arches. A world held together not by blood, but by high imagination. Yes, it failed, all things do. But in failing, it gave us something deeper. It gave us the map, not just of roads and provinces, but of human nature. Ambition and greed, duty and corruption, unity and decay. It showed us what to build, what to avoid, what happens when we forget each other. And in the end, it gave us something else too, something rare. A legacy that outlived the state. Because most empires are forgotten the moment they fall. Their stories vanish, their symbols erased. But Rome still speaks. It speaks in marble ruins that draw millions each year, in the architecture of cathedrals and congress halls, in the language of doctors, lawyers, scientists, and priests, in the silent awe we feel when we see a crumbling aqueduct stretching across a hillside. Even in sleep it speaks, because the story of Rome is the story of what we could be, what we have been, and what we might yet become. So now, as we reach the end of our journey softly, gently, we let go of Rome not with a scream, but with a whisper. Over 1,000 years of empire unraveled not in fire, but in frost forgetfulness, and the gentle quiet of everyday people doing their best in uncertain times. We watched emperors fall, cities shift, borders fade. We listened to monks copying Cicero by candlelight. We felt the weight of law codes, of Latin phrases, of domes built to touch the heavens. We stood at the gates of Constantinople knowing they wouldn't hold forever. And through it all, we saw what made Rome endure not its might, but its meaning. Rome was never just bricks and borders, it was belief. And in order, in purpose, in shared humanity. Its fall was tragic, yes, but also beautiful. Because it reminds us that all things pass. That even the greatest achievements rest on fragile foundations. That legacy is not about lasting forever, but about leaving something behind that still stirs the soul. So sleep now, if you haven't already. Let marble columns melt into dreams. Let Latin lullabies drift through the dark. Let the story of Rome wrap around you like a warm toga on a cold stone bench. And when you wake, carry a piece of it with you. Not the empire, but the idea